The thing about almost dying is that it shows you exactly who loves you, not who says they do, not who posts about it, who actually picks up the phone. My name is Carol Myers. I'm 29 years old. I work as a hospital records administrator, which means I spend my days surrounded by paperwork that tells the truth about people. Insurance forms, next of kin designations, emergency contact lists. Documents that don't lie, even when the people named on them do. I know hospitals the way most people know their own living rooms. The smell of recycled air and antiseptic. The particular hush of a corridor at 2 in the morning. The sound a gurney makes when it rounds a corner. I know all of it. I never imagined I'd be on the other side of the clipboard. But on a Tuesday in November, I was. I was the one on the table. I was the one whose vitals were dropping. I was the one whose file an OR nurse flipped open to find emergency contacts, 2 names, my parents, Linda and David Myers, and reached for the phone. What happened next changed my life. Not the surgery, not the recovery, not even the scar that runs along my left side like a quiet reminder that I'm still here. What changed my life was what my mother said when that nurse called, and what she did 14 minutes later, and what I found out about it 3 weeks after that, lying in a hospital bed I hadn't left yet, when my Aunt Rosa walked in, carrying not flowers, not balloons, not a get-well card, but a manila envelope with a notary seal and 11 years of patience written all over her face. I used to think the kidney almost killed me. Now I understand that some things that almost kill you were never the real danger. Before we dive into how I set myself free, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story speaks to you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. I want to start before the hurt because I think that matters. I think it matters that I didn't come into this story already guarded. I didn't come in suspicious or withdrawn or braced for impact. I came in open, completely embarrassingly open. The kind of open that only makes sense when you're a child who has been taught consistently and convincingly that the people around her are her foundation. My mother, Linda Myers, was extraordinary at the performance of motherhood. I say that not with bitterness, or not only with bitterness, but with genuine acknowledgement. She was good at it. The packed lunches with handwritten notes tucked under the sandwich, the birthday parties that looked like magazine spreads, the way she'd cup my face in her hands when I was small and say, "You are my whole heart, Carol. Don't you ever forget that." I didn't forget it. That was the problem. I held on to those words for years. I treated them like evidence, like documentation. She said it, so it must be true. I was a records administrator even as a child, filing away every proof of love, cross-referencing it against every moment of coldness, always concluding in her favor. My father, David Myers, was quieter about it. He showed love the way some men do, through presence rather than words. He'd drive me to school without being asked. He'd sit beside me during thunderstorms when I was little, not saying anything, just being there. There was a version of him I adored, a version that felt safe. We were a family of 4, my parents, my older brother Ethan, and me. We lived in a clean, well-kept house in a suburb that valued its lawns and its image in equal measure. We went to church on alternating Sundays. We had a photo wall in the hallway, curated, color-coordinated, beautiful. I appear on that photo wall 11 times. I counted once on a Christmas visit while my mother was in the kitchen. Ethan appears 34 times. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The memory I return to most, the one I'd have used if you asked me, even 3 years ago, to prove that my mother loved me, is the summer I was 14. I had been sick that year, not seriously, not in the way that would later redefine my life, but persistently. A kidney condition that required monitoring, medication adjustments, and more doctor's appointments than a teenager wants to think about. It was the year I started understanding that my body and I had a complicated relationship. My mother handled it with what I can only describe as devoted efficiency. She kept a binder, an actual tabbed, color-coded binder of my medical records, my lab results, my medication schedules. She attended every appointment. She asked the doctors questions I wouldn't have known to ask. She sat with me in waiting rooms and held my hand during blood draws without making me feel fragile for needing that. That summer, she drove me 2 hours each way, every other week, to see a specialist in the city. We'd stop at the same diner on the way back, a booth by the window, grilled cheese for me, black coffee for her, and she'd tell me stories about her own childhood, her mother, her sister Rosa, who she described with complicated affection. Rosa always did things her own way. Those afternoons in that diner booth are the closest I ever felt to her. I believed completely that she was my person, that regardless of whatever smallness or distance I sometimes felt at home, when it mattered, when I was sick, when I was scared, when I needed someone to show up, she would show up. I built my entire understanding of her on that belief. My Aunt Rosa was different. She was quieter in her affection, less performative, less present. She lived about 40 minutes away, and we saw her at holidays and occasionally in between. She and my mother had a relationship I never fully understood. Cordial, careful, like two people who shared a history they'd agreed not to discuss in front of the children. What I knew about Rosa was this. She had gentle hands, she smelled like cedar and something floral, she always brought me books instead of toys, and she looked at me sometimes with an expression I couldn't name. Not pity, something more like recognition, like she was keeping a record of her own. My grandmother, Grandma Myers, my father's mother, passed away when I was 18. I was in my first semester of college when it happened, and I grieved her quietly and privately the way I did most things. She had been a reserved woman, practical, the kind of person who expressed love through action rather than language. She'd given me a sewing kit once for my 16th birthday, and inside the lid, she'd written in her small, precise handwriting, "For the girl who fixes things quietly, may you always know your worth." I kept that sewing kit. I didn't know when she died that she had done something for me that would take 11 years to unfold. I didn't know that she had sat with an attorney and made a decision rooted in the deepest kind of love, the kind that looks ahead, that anticipates danger, that says, I see what's happening and I refuse to leave her unprotected. I didn't know any of that. I just knew I missed her, and I went back to my dorm room, made myself a cup of tea, and returned to the work of becoming someone she would have been proud of. The changes didn't announce themselves. That's the part I wish someone had warned me about, the part that makes betrayal so particularly devastating. It doesn't arrive with a label. It arrives disguised as nothing, as ordinary days, as small, easily explained moments that you file away individually and never think to look at together until you finally do, and by then the picture is undeniable. I graduated college at 22 with a degree in health information management. I moved back to the city, found an apartment I could afford on an entry-level salary, and began building the version of my adult life I'd imagined. Modest, but mine. Quiet, but intentional. Every morning, loose-leaf tea, 10 minutes of journaling, not to emote onto the page, but to observe, to stay clear-eyed about my own interior. I was methodical about most things. I was less methodical about my family. The first shift I noticed was around my brother Ethan's wedding. I was 24. Ethan was marrying a woman named Priya, and the wedding consumed my mother entirely, which I understood and didn't begrudge. What I noticed was smaller than that. I was asked, without much discussion, to pay for my own bridesmaid dress, a detail that wouldn't sting at all in a vacuum, but Ethan's groomsmen, I found out later, had their suits covered by my parents. When I mentioned it, lightly, carefully, my mother said, "Oh, Carol, you've always been so independent, we figured you'd prefer to handle it yourself." Independent. It was the first time I heard that word used as a reason to exclude me. It would not be the last. Over the next few years, the pattern sharpened. Family vacations I heard about after, holiday dinners where the menu revolved entirely around Ethan's preferences, where the conversation centered on his promotions, his children, my nephew and niece who I adored, his life. I was present at these gatherings, seated at the table, eating the food, laughing at the right moments, but I was present the way background music is present, audible but not really listened to. My mother began documenting the family on social media in that period, Instagram primarily. She was good at it, genuinely skilled at composition and caption writing, and the specific art of making a family look luminous. The posts were warm, effusive, #heavy. Family is everything. Blessed beyond measure. Home is where these people are. I noticed early on that I appeared rarely. When I pointed this out, once, directly, when I was 26, my mother looked genuinely puzzled and said, "But Carol, you never want your photo taken." I didn't push back. I went home and journaled about it for longer than 10 minutes. The medical piece complicated everything. My kidney condition, the one my mother had managed with such devoted efficiency when I was 14, was not something that resolved. It was something I lived with, managed, monitored. By my mid-20s, the monitoring had become more serious. There were conversations with specialists about long-term outcomes. There were ranges on lab reports that trended in directions I didn't like. I went to those appointments alone because I was an adult and I managed my own health care, and because I had, without consciously deciding to, stopped expecting my mother to show up. She didn't ask. I didn't invite. We maintained a careful, loving-looking distance. There was a phone call I keep coming back to. I was 27. I had just received results that my nephrologist had described as a crossroads conversation, meaning the transplant that had always been a distant possibility was becoming a present reality. I called my mother that night. I wasn't panicking, I've never been someone who panics, but I wanted to tell her. I think some part of me still wanted her to reach for the binder. She listened. Then she said, "Well, you've always been so resilient, Carol. I'm sure you'll figure it out. Oh, did I tell you Ethan's getting promoted again?" And she moved on. I stayed on the phone for another 12 minutes talking about Ethan's promotion, and I said all the right things, and when I hung up, I sat in my kitchen with my tea going cold, and I looked at the wall, and I thought, something is wrong, and it has been wrong for a long time. But I didn't name it, not then. Naming it felt like giving up on something I'd spent 27 years believing in. So instead, I opened my journal and I wrote in my small, careful handwriting, "Note to self, call the specialist back Monday, and stop waiting for her to remember." The last thing I'll tell you about this period, the thing that, when I look back, feels most significant, is this. About 8 months before my surgery, I was visiting my parents' house for a Sunday dinner. My mother was in the kitchen, my father was watching television, I was standing in the hallway looking at the photo wall. I counted again, force of habit. She'd added new photos since my last count. Ethan's family, mostly, a new portrait, a holiday picture, a candid from a camping trip. In the entire updated wall, 14 new photographs, I appeared in 0. I stood there for a long moment, then I went into the kitchen and I helped my mother set the table, and I said nothing about it. I used to think silence was safety. I didn't know yet that in my grandmother's hands it had already been turned into strategy.
The surgery was scheduled, and then it wasn't, and then it was urgent. That's how it happens sometimes. You plan for something, you prepare yourself psychologically, you get on the list, and you wait, and you try to live your normal life around the enormous fact of what's coming, and then one Thursday evening, your phone rings, and it's your transplant coordinator, and she says words like donor match and within the next 12 hours, and the planning collapses into the pure animal urgency of now. I called my best friend Diane first. She was at my apartment within 20 minutes, already packed a bag, already pulled up the hospital's address on her phone. That's who Diane is. I called my parents second. My father answered. He said, okay, and of course, and we'll be there, in the careful, measured way he said most things. I believed him. I had no reason not to. This was surgery. This was my life. I got to the hospital. The process moved fast, the way it does when something is time-sensitive and the institution around you is calibrated for urgency. Forms, assessments, preparations. I updated my emergency contacts with the intake nurse. Both parents, phone numbers confirmed. I put on the gown. I let Diane hold my hand until they told her she had to wait outside. The last thing I saw before they wheeled me through those double doors was her face, frightened and trying not to show it, and completely, entirely present. I went under. What happened in the waiting room, what happened in the world outside my unconsciousness, I learned in pieces afterward. From Diane, from the hospital staff, from records I later had legitimate access to because I know exactly how to find them. The OR nurse called my mother at 11:47 p.m. Linda Myers answered the phone. The nurse explained the situation: emergency transplant, in surgery, going well, but the family should know. My mother said, and I'm telling you, these are the documented words, the words a witness heard, the words Diane later confirmed from her own conversation with the nurse, who was visibly unsettled enough to mention it. She's not our burden anymore. She's always handled things on her own. And she ended the call. At 12:01 a.m., 14 minutes later, my mother posted a photograph on Instagram, a family photo taken earlier that evening. My father, my brother Ethan, Priya, the grandchildren, my mother at the center, everyone smiling. The caption read, "Family time comes first. Grateful for these people every single day. Prayer hand, red heart." I was on an operating table. She was choosing a filter. Diane saw the post from the waiting room. She told me later that she sat there for a long time, staring at her phone, trying to decide what to do with what she was feeling. She said the post had already collected 37 likes by the time she put her phone down. My father never came. He later told me he hadn't wanted to cause a fuss and had assumed my mother had handled the call. He had gone to bed. I was in surgery for 4 hours and 19 minutes. I came out the other side of it alive, with a kidney that wasn't mine yet and a body that was learning to accept it. The first few days of recovery are blurry. Pain medication and exhaustion and the strange, floaty quality of existing in a body that has been opened and repaired. Diane was there when I woke up. She didn't tell me about the phone call right away. She waited until I was more coherent, more present, more capable of receiving it. When she told me, 3 days post-surgery, sitting in that hospital bed, the afternoon light coming through the blinds in pale stripes across the floor, I didn't cry. I went very still. I'm a records administrator. I understand the significance of timestamps. I understood in that moment, with the kind of clarity that only comes from shock, that the phone rang at 11:47 p.m. and the post went live at 12:01 a.m., and the math of that 14 minutes was a document of its own, irrefutable, time-stamped, permanent. My mother hadn't been busy. She hadn't been overwhelmed. She hadn't been asleep or out of reach or in a panic. She had made a choice, and then she had made a post. I looked at the ceiling of that hospital room for a long time. Then I looked at Diane and I said quietly, "Okay." Just that, okay. Not because I was fine, not because it didn't devastate me in ways I wouldn't fully feel for weeks, but because something in me, the same part that had been journaling for 10 minutes every morning, observing rather than drowning, recognized this moment as a border, as the line between the version of my life where I kept rationalizing and the version where I finally stopped. I didn't know yet about the envelope. I didn't know yet what my grandmother had done. But even without that, something had clarified. Something I had been avoiding for years had become undeniable. She had told a stranger her daughter was not her burden, and then she had chosen a photograph. I'm going to stop here for a second. If this story is resonating with you, if you've ever felt the specific pain of being dismissed by the people who were supposed to show up, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It really does let me know that sharing these hard stories is worth it. Thank you.
Recovery is a strange kind of solitude. The physical kind, the getting stronger kind, moves in a direction, even when it's slow. Every day, slightly better than the one before it. More range of motion, less pain. The body has a logic to it, a stubbornness, an insistence on continuing. I was grateful for that stubbornness. I held on to it. The other kind of recovery, the internal kind, doesn't move in a line. It was on day 11 of my hospital stay that Aunt Rosa came. I had seen my parents once by then, a brief, stiff visit on day 4 when my mother arrived with a grocery bag of things I didn't need, and a manner so breezy and normal that I wondered for a confused moment if Diane had gotten it wrong. My mother kissed my cheek. She asked about the food. She told me about a show she'd been watching. My father stood by the window and looked at his hands. She didn't mention the phone call. She didn't mention the post. I didn't bring it up either. Not yet. I was still a patient in a hospital bed, and I didn't have the energy, physical or emotional, to open that door. So I let her perform her visit. I said the expected things. She left after 40 minutes, and I lay back against my pillow, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. Enormous, quiet relief that she was gone. That told me something. Rosa arrived on a Tuesday, late morning when the ward was quiet and the nursing staff had settled into their midday rhythm. She knocked on the doorframe even though it was open, which was something she'd always done, a small courtesy, a deliberate pause before entering someone else's space. She was carrying a manila envelope and a small box of the specific loose-leaf tea she knew I liked. She set the tea on the tray table. Then she sat down and she looked at me for a long moment, and she said, "Your grandmother knew, Carol. She knew a long time ago, and she wanted to make sure you'd be all right." Then she placed the envelope in my hands. I want to describe that moment carefully because I think it matters that I tell you what it felt like before I tell you what it contained. It felt like someone had been standing behind a wall for 11 years, witnessing everything, keeping careful record, and had finally stepped out and said, "I saw. I was here. You weren't invisible." That undid me more than anything else. Not the money, not the legal architecture, the being seen. I cried for the first time since the surgery. The envelope contained the documentation of a trust established by Eleanor Myers, my grandma Myers, in the year I turned 18, the year she died. It had been drafted by an attorney, witnessed, notarized, and placed in Rosa's custody as trustee with explicit instructions.
The estate included a paid-off commercial property, a small strip of retail units in what had been, in Grandma's time, an unremarkable neighborhood, and what was now, after a decade of gentrification, extremely valuable. The rental income from those units? $8,400 per month. The trust had one condition for release: documented proof of neglect or abandonment by the immediate family. Rosa had been collecting that proof for 11 years, quietly, without ever signaling to anyone what she was doing. Birthday cards returned unopened, a voicemail preserved, digitally archived, in which my mother referred to me as exhausting and always so needy about her health stuff. Records of holidays I'd spent alone, documented through my own social media timestamps cross-referenced with family gathering posts that didn't include me. And now, the hospital call log, which Rosa had already obtained through proper channels with the assistance of the attorney, timestamped 11:47 p.m. The Instagram post, screenshotted and preserved, 12:01 a.m. 14 minutes. Documented, permanent. The attorney's letter, which Rosa read to me in a voice that didn't waver, contained a passage from my grandmother's original trust language. I'm going to share it with you because it needs to be heard. If the evidence confirms what I fear, that my granddaughter has not been valued or protected as she deserves, then she is to receive the full benefit of this estate without condition or contest. She has always fixed things quietly. It is time someone fixed something for her. I held those pages in both hands and I thought about a sewing kit. I thought about small, precise handwriting. I thought about a woman who had watched, said nothing outwardly, and then sat with an attorney and decided that love, real love, plans ahead. The weeks that followed were legally straightforward and personally seismic. My parents were not entitled to contest the trust. The terms were unambiguous, the documentation irrefutable, the attorney both competent and thorough. My mother called me 4 times in the 2 weeks after Rosa's visit. I let the calls to voicemail. In one message, she said she didn't understand what was happening. In another, she said I was being dramatic. In the third, she said she loved me and she hoped she knew that. In the fourth, she said nothing for a moment and then hung up. My father sent a text. It said, "Carol, I hope you're healing well." I didn't respond to any of them. Not because I was staging a dramatic withdrawal, but because I had finally, for the first time in 29 years, stopped arranging my behavior around managing their comfort. That quiet was mine. I had earned it. And it felt, against anything I might have expected, like the first full breath I'd taken in years. People ask about the money first. I understand why. It's the tangible part, the measurable part, the part that makes sense as a sentence. She found out her grandmother left her a commercial property generating over $100,000 a year. That part has a satisfying shape to it, a clear before and after. But that's not where the healing lived. The money changed my circumstances. The healing changed my understanding. And those are 2 entirely different kinds of transformation. Let me tell you what actually worked. The first thing I did, before I touched a dollar of the trust, before I talked to the attorney about next steps, before I made any decisions about any of it, was I took myself seriously. That sounds small. It isn't. I had spent 29 years in a family that taught me to be low maintenance, to handle things on my own, to be so self-sufficient that my needs became invisible, and then to feel quietly grateful that no one was burdened by them. I had internalized their narrative about me so completely that I'd started writing it myself. Independent Carol, resilient Carol, Carol who doesn't need much. The first real act of healing was looking at that narrative and saying, that wasn't independence, that was adaptation to neglect. There is a difference. I needed to understand the difference before I could move forward. I found a therapist, a good one, not the first one I tried, but the second, a woman named Dr. Serena Hall, who had a small office with a window that looked out onto a parking lot, which somehow made the whole thing feel appropriately unromantic and therefore trustworthy. She didn't let me perform being fine. She had a particular gift for sitting in silence after I said something I thought was sufficiently processed, in a way that made clear she was waiting for the real thing underneath it. It took about 3 months before I said in one of our sessions the sentence I had never let myself say. I wanted my mother to come. Not to the hospital specifically, in general. All of it. The appointments I'd gone to alone, the results I'd received in empty waiting rooms, the surgery I'd navigated without her. Beneath all the competent self-sufficiency was a 29-year-old woman who had wanted her mother to come and had spent years converting that want into evidence that she didn't need her.
Dr. Hall didn't fix that. You don't fix that. But naming it changed the weight of it. Named things can be carried differently than unnamed things. I also changed my mornings. I kept the tea, I kept the 10 minutes of journaling, but I added something. After writing, I read back one entry from exactly a year before, not to track progress, not to measure growth, just to remember what it actually felt like to be myself in a given moment, to take my own experience as data rather than background noise. It was a small practice with a large effect. It made me a more reliable witness to my own life. I learned, slowly, what my friendships were actually made of. Diane already knew. She'd been at the hospital. She'd been in the waiting room. She had seen what my mother posted and had still been there at 6 a.m. when I came out of surgery. Some people you already know. But there were others, work colleagues, neighbors, the kind of relationships you'd kept at comfortable arm's length, who surprised me with their warmth when I let them close enough to offer it. I had been so accustomed to not being someone people showed up for that I had stopped making room for them to try. That changed. I want to say something about forgiveness, because it comes up when people hear stories like this, and I've made my peace with the question. I have not forgiven my mother. I'm not sure I will. Not because I'm holding bitterness like a weapon, I'm genuinely not. I don't have the energy for it, and I don't think it serves me. But because forgiveness, as I understand it now, is something you arrive at when the person who hurt you has demonstrated understanding of what they did. That hasn't happened. My mother, to this day, believes she is the victim of an unfair legal situation and a daughter who overreacted. What I have done is released her, released the version of her I was always trying to deserve, released the belief that if I was just more easygoing, more present, more impressive, more something, she would finally look at me the way she looked at Ethan. She won't. She isn't built for it. That's the truth I finally let land. And here's the thing about releasing someone. It leaves your hands free. My hands were free for the first time in 29 years. I used them to sign the trust documents, to meet with the property manager who had been running Grandma's units for a decade and was, as it turned out, excellent at his job. To have a long, quiet conversation with Rosa over the specific loose-leaf tea she'd brought me in the hospital, in her kitchen, where she told me things about my grandmother I'd never known, and I understood, sitting there, that I came from something real. I come from a woman who loved me in the most durable way possible, who looked at what was happening to me and decided that love without action is just a feeling, and feelings alone don't protect anyone. She chose to protect me, and I am still learning how to let that in.
There's a window in my new apartment, an actual window in an actual apartment I chose because I could afford to choose it, that faces east. Every morning I make my tea, I sit with it for 10 minutes. I watch the light change, and sometimes I think about an operating table and a phone ringing and a woman who answered it and made her choice, and I feel something I didn't expect to feel about any of it. gratitude. Not for the betrayal. I want to be precise about that. I am not grateful for what my mother did, or for what my father didn't do, or for the years of quiet exclusion that preceded all of it. I don't believe in the narrative that suffering makes you who you are, that you should thank the people who hurt you for the lessons they taught. That narrative serves the people who caused the harm, and I'm not interested in serving them. What I'm grateful for is the clarity. Because before that phone call, before those 14 minutes, before that timestamp, before Rosa walked into my hospital room with a manila envelope and 11 years of patient, deliberate love, I might have gone on rationalizing, reframing, returning to that diner booth memory and holding it up against every piece of evidence to the contrary and still concluding in her favor. The timestamp ended that. Some truths are so clear that even the most devoted self-deception can't survive them. And what I know now, what I would carry into any version of my future, with or without a commercial property or a trust or any of the tangible pieces of this story, is this. You are not a burden for needing people. You are not independent for surviving without them. There is no virtue in learning to need nothing. The virtue, if we're going to talk about virtue, is in learning to recognize what's real, in stopping the rationalizations, in naming things accurately. My grandmother named things accurately, quietly, without drama, without confrontation. She sat with an attorney and she said, "Watch, and when you have enough, protect her." I am protected. I am learning to accept that. And I am watching the light change every morning through an east-facing window in a life that is finally, unmistakably, entirely my own. Have you ever been betrayed by someone who was supposed to protect you? How did you rebuild trust? What is one thing you learned about yourself after a betrayal? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. This was another story from Revenge Room, where we turn pain into purpose and betrayal into balance. Please don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next transformation.